really talking about things that are unprecedented, right? There are infrastructure needs that all of those countries have. There are employment needs, there's food, the farming, the whole thing. And by the way, if I ever gave you the impression that I thought this would be simple, I'm sorry. The governments in these countries are problematic, to say the least. So you can't just wish that away. Corruption in foreign aid is always an issue, and it's not going to go away because we have a different thought about it. But what I'm thinking of is a lot of the sorts of programs that have gone on before on a much greater level. They have great nutrition needs. I mentioned the level of violence against women. Finding a way to get these resources directly to people, always a challenge. Always a challenge. NGOs ideally would be utilized to a great degree. They're not without their own challenges. The political fighting that goes on over foreign aid would not go away with any of this. So
let's try this again.
I'm really good at yelling.
Yeah, I can hear her.
Well, I want everybody else to hear.
There are two things that you didn't mention, and I'm sure that you feel the same as I do about them. One is the School of the Americas, which is like essential.
Could you speak louder? We can't hear you.
Oh, okay. He didn't mention the School of the Americas. You know, it's now called WINSEC. They changed the name so people wouldn't know what it was really about.
Maybe people don't know what it's about here.
It's where we train assassins.
Oh yeah, no, I barely scratched the surface of our hip.
And the other thing is the drug war. You didn't mention the drug war, the failed drug war.
Oh, again, I briefly over the surface of our history. It goes far deeper than that. No, absolutely. The history, our history in those countries is horrific. You're quite right. Am I calling up people?
See if this will work.
Thank you for giving us that overview and something to think about. But I came in wondering about lost opportunities. If we fund that, what about the challenge of climate change, which seems overarching the whole world? And then if we fund that, won't it feel like we're forgetting about white male supremacy here? If we fund that, aren't we forgetting about the growing challenge of income disparity and dark money? So why is this the one to start with versus others?
I by no means think if this were adopted, Congress would shut down and only operate on this. The size that we're talking about, as I said, for a start, if we switch the $4 billion that we spend on border security to aid for Central America and then spend just the $140 million that we spend on aid to Central America now for border security, there'd be no increase in the expenditure. So just for a simple trade, that would be a start. But climate change, if you were talking about a serious foreign aid policy, I think new renewable energy would obviously be a sort of program that would be a piece of it too. So I mean, we don't have the luxury, as you know, of just picking one thing in this world. We can't. Everything else won't go away while we work on one. We're stuck with that.
Thank you very much. One of the things that I caught at the beginning of your talk was the idea that there was an unusual coalition of interests that supported the Marshall Plan. And my suspicion is hiding amongst those unusual coalition. You mentioned business as well as State Department as well as maybe humanitarian thoughts. My thought was there was maybe something a little selfish behind there. There might have been an economic benefit imagined for the United States. Can you describe what you think would be the difference or the similarities between the economic benefits of a Marshall Plan and the WHO or something other, your Central American version?
Oh yeah, no, I did mention that in passing, that you often have surprising support from certain business sectors if it's their goods that are going to be bought. In general, they're against it because, it's taxes, right? And we don't want to pay taxes. But if you're buying the goods. So yes, absolutely. There would, in fact, American companies often benefit greatly from foreign aid. And, they put riders into the foreign aid bills about American-sourced goods. So yes, there would be self-interest. It has been always. There was in the case of the post-World War II reconstruction of Europe, and there would be in Central America. And that's something we might wish were otherwise, but it's real. And we should always try and figure out to what way, while we might want to reorganize the economic system dramatically, at the same time, we need to always consider what way it can be taken advantage of as it currently exists for better ends. So, yeah, if we now have some of the Chamber of Commerce lining up for this because we're going to use American products in an agricultural development program, better than them lining up to build hypersonic missiles.
Yeah, you mentioned. Hello? Yeah. Do you envision that this Marshall Plan will be primarily a competitive one with the One Belt, One Road that China is now doing? Or do you think there might be room for cooperation? Because as I understand it, the China's One Belt, One Road is an initiative that is welcoming participation from Western countries like the UK and Japan, for example.
Again, this level of detail is probably beyond what can be prescribed at this point. But it's like this. I would prefer that the U.S., China, and everybody else look at the world as a place they cooperate in. But for those who are concerned with U.S. Supremacy in terms of influence, if they want to compete in terms of what they can construct and constructiveness rather than destructiveness, that's better than the status quo.
You use the word motivation. Boy, is that a challenging word. After the law was passed that corporations are people, I was disgusted by it. It certainly began influencing things that were going, therefore, at least to me, it seemed in the wrong direction. What do you do in terms of making people that have the authority to regulate some of the things that have been happening to us of recent years in terms of what's even legal, and now we're even fighting the acceptance of what effective laws are already in place because they're not being addressed by Trump's administration in so many ways. Where at what point you used to think about the infrastructure in other countries? Our own infrastructure. You just look on Van Ness in terms of the pipes and the things that they're trying to do. We need it also here, let alone the need, as you pointed out, yes, for other countries, so that those people can remain in the countries they live in. How do you get the ideas across to the people that have the power to make the changes that should, yes, be made in terms of the things you pointed out?
Well, I think the largest single factor there is the White House. Most of the people involved in these sorts of programs, I think, have good motives, right? And the current White House is having great problems with people in the bureaucracy who are there because they get to make a living, they hope, doing something they thought was beneficial for the country or for humanity. I don't think our great problem is there. A program like I'm speaking about here, the Romero plan, is only going to happen with a White House with totally different motivation than the current one. If we had the major change that I hope to see come out of this election, I don't know how far I'm supposed to go in mentioning candidates at this forum, but the way that Ronald Reagan represented a seismic shift in the wrong direction when he got elected, when you had members of Congress who were, middling, all of a sudden the wind was blowing in Ronald Reagan's direction and they all joined up. I mean, let's face it, for those of you who remember that, it was impressive. I wish I didn't have to say that, but it was impressive, the sea change that he brought to Washington, D.C. That's what we need in the other direction. Something like this is, a rank and file member of the House can propose it, and some maybe already have. And it's like, there's a reparations bill in Congress, and that's important, and people file them. But you don't see that kind of change unless all of a sudden the middling members of Congress go, whoa, the wind is blowing the other way. And we should look at renewal in all sorts of areas. I mean, I think, on a note of optimism, again, without naming names, though the result of the last election was horrific, there was also at the same time a totally new wind in the other direction. And I think, and that did not come from a winning campaign. And politics, I think, were altered permanently in both directions as a result of the last. Now, if we can imagine that other wave taking the White House, I think things like this become possible. Rethinking obviously, the question of economic inequality in this country is on the horizon like it never was before. And the idea of an alternative foreign policy, I think, is possible only if that kind of change happens in the White House.
Thank you.
Hi, Tom. Good stuff. I agree with pretty much everything you said. Just some random thoughts and reactions to what you said. One of the constituents that I think actually would be supportive of this idea is actually the U.S. military. For many years, they've actually advocated behind the scenes for a legalization program for undocumented immigrants because they view, even before Trump, the crisis at the border as a threat to national security. Even though we don't like hearing that from Trump, the military actually views that as a threat, and one way to mollify the military and how they feel about this is they actually would like to be more generous on immigration policies, and one of the first things they would want to do is to help advocate positions, not necessarily military, but to help clean up Central America. I know we don't like to admit this, but there actually is a very increasing number of Nicaraguans that are fleeing Nicaragua now because of oppression there. And so we shouldn't ignore that. There are increasing numbers of Nicaraguans that are coming to the border as well. The other thing is that again, I'm not a big defender of the Obama administration when it came to the border either. After unaccompanied children began coming in 2014, they reacted in the wrong way by creating family detention centers. And so, but they did begin investing in Central America And they understood the problems of to a certain degree, they understood the problems of the governments there and the corruption. And so they tried to put a lot of money, invest some of the money through NGOs. And there are reports of some successes on the ground of NGOs in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras. And that was one of the very first things that Trump eliminated was that program that began funneling some money through NGOs to Central America. So there actually is evidence, progress was made in that kind of investment. And I guess it's clear that a couple things on why business would support this. It's because of CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. It isn't just about using American products for the infrastructure there. It's about eventually what they perceive as trade. That's why they support NAFTA, and that's why they've long supported CAFTA as well. That doesn't get any publicity, but that's why they would support this. And the other thing it's clear that there are conditions that would have to be placed on monies going to those countries, conditions placed on governments. Very difficult to sell, but that is what was successfully done to a degree in the EU until the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. When billions of dollars were invested in the poorer countries as a condition for them entering the EU, those countries had to go along with giving up a certain amount of sovereignty. They had to go along with reforms in their social and judicial systems. And unfortunately, I think that if we're going to funnel money through governments, which some of it's going to have to be done that way, it's got to be done with conditions. And what happened in the EU is an example of the types of conditions that might work.
Okay, well, I'll say, so, that was a lot of stuff. The military, I think, thank you for the information about the actual border, but in general, we're not used to thinking about the military as a source of progressive thinking, but we're sometimes wrong on that. The military and the CIA and agency, I don't think should exist. Recognize climate change as a major problem, much more obviously than the man in the White House and many people in Congress. So, and if you've people here I'm sure have military in their families. I've never been in the military, but I did work cheek to jowl with them in Bosnia and East Timor to a certain extent, at least, just seeing who they were, etc. And if you were to meet a captain or something, what he's most concerned with is protecting the lives of the people under him, more than anything else. And most people in the military don't want to be used. They'd rather not be in combat, not everyone, but most. And it's always worth bearing in mind who these people are. Nicaragua, certainly, Daniel Ortega has been disappointing in various ways over the years for those of us who, railed against the Contras and so forth. I've seen the rallies in this town, even against the government, but it nonetheless is quite interesting for one thing that the murder rate is so much lower there than those other three countries. The Obama administration, I am not a big fan either, but let's face it, lots of really good people flocked to it. When I was in the Massachusetts legislature way back in the last millennium, and when I'd be around the polls on election day, which is a custom that doesn't happen here in San Francisco or California, I think, but the poll workers would all be around trying to get that last voter, some info in their hand, etc. And I would note that the campaigners and a lot of the aides were so much better politically than the people they worked for. And my goal was always to try and be as good as the people who supported me, which was not the case, I thought, many of the people I saw, but idealistic people flocked to the Obama administration for good reason. Much as we have criticisms of it that I think are quite valid, both on the foreign policy and the domestic front, it was to a lot of people, when you compare it to what we have now, what you had in George Bush, it was a refuge. So, not surprisingly, and I made a note trade here, but I forget what I was going to say on that. But the EU conditions, yes, of course, I did mention that the governments that are there are often horrific. And the EU is also giving an example of the limitations now. There's been a lot of writing recently about how right-wing governments are, of course, control this aid that comes from the EU, and they parcel it out both through political allies and also in corrupt fashion. And there's not, an immediate answer for this, but certainly, if you want to imagine a program like this, serious conditions would have to be applied.
There's so many buts, Tom.
Sorry. Let's
Of course,
thank
this is the real world.
Ridiculous.
let's thank Tom Gallagher now for his presentation and for coming this morning. Yes.
May I mentioned earlier that, I didn't mention the date, in January 28th, we're having a program with Stephen Zunas, who I think some of you know, Risa Ehrlich, who has spoken here, Cynthia Papermaster, who's with Code Pink, and myself at USF, Foreign Policy, The Final Frontier. And I want to pass around, if you're interested in getting details on that, just sign up. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. We still have a bit of time, so if you guys have more questions, you can come up and talk to him individually. All right, and we